I'd like to begin, as others have, with thanking the conference organizers. It's a real privilege to be here on a very important topic, which certainly is also very rich and complex, and certainly something in which we want to continue to be engaged with. The topic of my paper is on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, a topic of which I've been focusing on for several years now. Specifically, though, I'm looking at it from the angle of the United Nations and non-governmental organizations. Early in the days of its existence, the United Nations became deeply entrenched in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, proposing a two-state solution in 1947. And the international body has continued to be of importance to efforts to establish security, to foster peaceful cohabitation, and to meet the needs of the inhabitants of the region. Non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, have sought to improve the lives of people in Israel-Palestine. Some of this work is done in coordination with the international community. Utilizing the United Nations as its primary focal point, this paper examines the relationship between the United Nations and the peace process while bearing in mind the roles played by non-governmental actors in building peace. Utilizing as a case study, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis that transpired in the Gaza Strip during the summer of 2006, the paper concludes that NGOs have an integral role to play in the peace process, fulfilling the partnership relationship outlined by the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali in 1994. NGOs have their most significant role in United Nations affairs through the Economic and Social Council. Indeed, it is only through this branch that such organizations have recognized rights for observance and participation. It is through the Council that NGOs obtain consultative status and the attached privileges, such as entrance into the Council's meetings. UN Charter Article 71, which addresses NGOs, was not originally part of the Charter, but through negotiations, NGOs were able to effect its inclusion as an amendment in 1945. In Willitz's estimation, it was one of two victories obtained by NGOs at that time. The other was fostering the inclusion of language into the Charter that identified human rights promotion as a fundamental purpose of the world body. Willits also notes that NGOs were unable to gain rights with the Security Council and General Assembly. While lacking formal recognition by the General Assembly, NGOs may participate in the sessions of the Assembly when invited. Their lobbying activities consist of such things as presenting issue papers or meeting with delegates. Advocating for their causes with the Security Council occurs even more informally than with the General Assembly. NGOs have been able to provide testimony on particular concerns at the Security Council, such as country-specific humanitarian matters and the effects of warfare on civilian populations. NGOs have also been active within a subordinate body of the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council. During his time as Secretary General, Boutros Ghali explained that with the end of the Cold War, the UN moved from an institution with a reputation of being the purview of nation states to one that more greatly recognized the inclusion of NGOs in the political process. Boutros Ghali outlined three areas for NGO participation in peace building, quote, assistance, mobilization, and democratization activities. In the area of assistance, he considered NGOs as instrumental in peacekeeping by being involved in preventative diplomacy, through acting as early warning sentries to growing crises in the regions they work. In terms of mobilization, Boutros Ghali tasked NGOs with the mission of helping sway public opinion in order to get states to act for peace in conjunction with the UN. For democratization, he identified that NGOs can help democracy through spreading democratic ideals and notions of peace, by supporting democratic growth within nations, and by monitoring democratic processes around the globe. It is the role of NGOs in peace building that will be demonstrated in the following case study. The concept of a Palestinian state with a democratically elected government has become a particularly complicated matter since the election of a Hamas-led government at the start of 2006, for it created a rift in Palestinian unity, pitting the Fatah movement against a group that is regarded by some as a terrorist organization. The situation was exacerbated when in May 2006, Fatah and Hamas-affiliated security personnel entered into armed clashes in Gaza. Shortly thereafter, our case study begins with a crisis that drew NGOs into peace-building efforts in conjunction with UN responses to the violent affairs starting at the end of June 2006. Some of the key events that transpired before the UN Security Council took up the matter are, first, Palestinian militants exited the Gaza Strip, attacked an Israeli Defense Forces position, and kidnapped a soldier named Gilad Shalit on June 25, 2006. And as you can see on the slide, he was subsequently freed not until 2011. Secondly, three groups, including Hamas's military organization, Izil Din al-Qassam Brigades, claimed responsibility and demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Gilad Shalit. Third, Israel started a military campaign using aircraft and ground forces to secure Shalit from Gaza on June 28th, which was called Operation Summer Rains. In 2007, I began to examine the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the issue of accusations of genocide as concentrated in United Nations discourse. The study followed on the heels of Hamas's recent takeover of the Gaza Strip, and it was also contemporary with the early days of Iran's nuclear ambitions, which is still a matter of concern today. I discovered that both Hamas and the then Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, were being accused of violating the UN Genocide Convention of 1948, and that NGOs were behind some of these accusations, which were presented in the material prepared for the first special session of the UN Human Rights Council, which met in July of 2006. Other NGOs presented statements for consideration at the Human Rights Council too. A joint statement by several groups, such as the International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations, welcomed the call for a special session and denounced what was considered the excessive use of force by Israel, even calling it barbarous warfare. Quote, they believed that the Human Rights Council was being given the chance to participate in, quote, a defining moment for the future credibility of the United Nations human rights system, end quote. Amnesty International shared with the authors of the joint statement the view that through the Council, the United Nations was poised to reshape the international body's response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Amnesty called upon the Human Rights Council to correct the errors of its predecessor, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which often considered the conflict but did little about it. Another NGO, the International Commission of Jurists, considered the crisis to be a significant test of the Council's credibility, but the group was not content with simply requesting an investigation. They believed that words were insufficient and fact-finding investigations would delay a resolution to the conflict. The jurists therefore called upon the Human Rights Council to urge the Security Council to do its job in responding with action, and failing movement by the Security Council to summon the General Assembly to exercise its authority to act when the Security Council is at an impasse. It is significant that the initial special session of the Human Rights Council was focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Council had just been created by the General Assembly in March of 2006 to take the place of the Commission on Human Rights. In the resolution, the Assembly acknowledged, quote, that non-governmental organizations play an important role in the national, regional, and international levels in the promotion and protection of human rights. The special session was requested by the Tunisian delegation at the United Nations on June 30th, 2006, in order to examine the intensification of the situation. One NGO, UN Watch, indicated that while the meeting was supposedly connected to Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip, the, quote, special session, if we consider the larger picture, is actually not that special at all. It is merely the latest instance of something that for over 3 decades has pervaded the United Nations, the demonization of Israel, end quote. The NGO explained that the call for the special session occurred soon after the Human Rights Council condemned Israel during its initial conference. UN Watch expressed its concern that the group of Arab states was behind a months-long campaign to denigrate the Jewish state through the new council. In truth, the Human Rights Council did pass a resolution during its first regular session, which singled out Israelis as violators of human rights in occupied areas without emphasizing potential violations by any Palestinian actors. The draft resolution was presented by Pakistan. Representing the group of Arab states, the Tunisian delegate expressed support for Pakistan and concern over the state of Palestinian affairs. The Israeli delegate followed, explaining that, quote, the council must not let itself become a mere instrument for Israel bashing and be politicized and subverted by propaganda. B'nai B'rith International, a Jewish NGO, expressed its concern that the Human Rights Council would be repeating the failings of the Commission on Human Rights by making the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a matter of such focus. The organization cautioned that if the new council fails to improve upon the old, then there would be ripple effects throughout the United Nations, undermining the process of reform ushered in by the Secretary General. The resolution that was adopted during the first special session was much more extensive than that of the first general session, specifically addressing the situation in the Gaza Strip, with an emphasis upon the actions of the Israeli government. A limited amount of text was reserved for any Palestinian actors who were contributing to the crisis. And the strongest language was focused on demanding that Israel cease its military activities in Palestinian territories, adhere to humanitarian and human rights law, and exercise restraint so as not to punish civilians collectively. Despite the recommendation of the International Commission of Jurists, the resolution did not contain any statements urging the Security Council or General Assembly to respond with force. This does not mean that those present at the Human Rights Council were not interested in bringing the Security Council into the matter. In fact, the Algerian delegation had already requested that the Security Council take up the issue. At the Security Council, however, the United States exercised its veto power to defeat a resolution proposed by Qatar condemning acts of aggression on both sides. And the special session of the Human Rights Council decided to send a fact-finding mission, though it unfortunately was blocked by the Israeli government and it was unable to move forward. So through those deliberations, there was not a great deal of movement forward in terms of peace. Conclusions. Given the failures of states and the international community to bring about long-lasting peace in Israel-Palestine, I initially wondered if more has been accomplished outside of governmental intervention to foster peace, security, and well-being than within the confines of UN diplomacy. I have changed this line of inquiry, recognizing now that non-governmental actors have become an integral part of UN efforts to foster peace, particularly in the post-Cold War era. The failures and successes of the United Nations are closely linked to the non-governmental groups that partner with the body as part of the civil society surrounding the organization. In the case study chosen for this paper, one can see the involvement of NGOs in their capacity as policy advocates related to their varied areas of expertise and work. The Human Rights Council was a fitting focal point for the study in light of the fact that NGOs were behind the incorporation into the UN Charter of a stronger human rights agenda. Peace building is a key part of securing fundamental human rights, and Boutros Ghali identified 3 areas in which NGOs should actively participate in the peace building process. That is by working in the fields of mobilization, democratization, and assistance. NGOs have been involved in all 3 areas as related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it is assistance and democratization that shone forth most brightly in the documents examined for the case study. Regarding assistance, Boutros Ghali mentioned that NGOs can practice preventative diplomacy because of their work with people around the world. World Vision International utilized its extensive experience in the Gaza Strip to call attention to matters of grave concern to the Human Rights Council. Concerning democratization efforts, Boutros Ghali emphasized NGO support for democracy within and between nation states. But the case study demonstrates that NGOs have been working not only to enhance democratic processes within states, but also within the United Nations itself. Thus, there were efforts, such as those by B'nai B'rith International, to encourage the Human Rights Council to be fairer in its deliberations on Israel-Palestine than its predecessor, the Commission on Human Rights. Such sentiments were similarly shared by nation states familiar with the Commission. Despite NGO advocacy efforts, member states of the United Nations, particularly the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, possess the power to further human rights and to build peace. They hold the greatest responsibility for the successes and failures of the international community. We should remember that actors in any given conflict, not the United Nations, are ultimately accountable for the maintenance of peace. The UN may go so far as to pass resolutions or impose sanctions intent on stability and peace, but if they are not backed by the cooperation of individual states, they lack efficacy. The UN has passed numerous resolutions, but the situation in Israel-Palestine has not improved in terms of establishing the type of peaceful cohabitation envisioned by the creators of early UN policy. And I will conclude by showing you on the map, this is the 1947 UN partition plan, which decided to divide the country according to a Jewish and Arab area, the darker area on the left-hand side being the area for Arab majority, the lighter area being for Israel. You can see, however, that shortly thereafter, Israel was founded had its declaration for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which then engulfed the region in a conflict between 1948 and 1949. You can see the armistice lines on the smaller map on the right-hand side, thus creating the West Bank, for instance. And now, as far as the United Nations moves forward with plans, let's say, for trying to encourage a two-state solution, it's more so a return to the armistice lines as represented in 1949 or somewhere thereabouts, in contrast to the earlier partition plan of 1947. Thank you.